My name is Cristian Pantazi. I'm a Romanian journalist. I'm the editor-in-chief of Hotnews.ro, and I have the pleasure to moderate this session, one of the most interesting panels of the Aspen Institute conference. I have the pleasure to have next to me two keynote speakers and five other distinguished guests that we are going to discuss about economic and security challenges in Asia and their impact in Eurasia. Just a few words before giving the floor to our keynote speakers. I know there is a Chinese curse saying, "May you live in interesting times," or at least is attributed to China. I'm not sure someone cursed us, but we are living interesting times, that's for sure. Searching for growth and security, Romania joined a few years ago both the European Union and NATO. But what happened a few years later? It looks like most of the economic growth moved to Asia, and the stability of Europe is now shaken by Russia. Today we are going to discuss about economic and security challenges in Asia and their impact in Asia, but also in Europe. We will start with two keynote speakers, then we will debate the topic with five panelists. Our first speaker today is Mr. Shen Weizhong, a young yet established diplomat, Chinese diplomat. The floor is yours, Mr. Weizhong, please.
Thank again for Romania, Aspen, for inviting me back. It's so good to be back, actually, because last year I was here given 7 minutes, and I remember, I think I did it with 12. So this year, Andre gave me 10 minutes. So you see the magic, the Sino-Romania friendship works here. So, okay, I have to make full use of my 10 minutes, very precious ones. I'm a diplomat by training, but since I'm in Romania, where East meets West, where diversity shines, so I will try not to be too diplomatic about it. So I will give you a little update and share with you some of my thoughts. Mainly is about China's initiative of One Belt and One Road, or in general sense, is a new Silk Road. Remembering last year, when I was here discussing this very interesting topic, what I gave you were many concepts. 2 wings of the Belt and Road, 3 principles, and 5 connections. If I have more time, I would love to elaborate, but let's do with it. And after 1 year, one very interesting year, as our moderator said, and lots of perfect storms, both in Europe and in Asia as well. How are we doing? I should report back that the Belt and Road Initiative are doing really not so bad at all. Here is my report. First of all, I would like to share with you a little experience I had just a few days ago. Before I was about to depart from my home to Bucharest in Beijing, where that is, my little son came to me. He knew that I am going to Europe. So he asked me, "Daddy, would you take a very big suitcase with you and bring back some of this wonderful milk to me?" European milk, he means. Then I looked into his eye. I said, "No, son." After he was a little bit disappointed, I said, "We can, right now, enjoy a little bit European amenities at home." So then I took out my smartphone, pressed the app, found what I want, sent the order, and pay for it, and asked my son to just wait for it a few days. I said, probably the milk will come before I come back home. And just the day before last, I was told that 2 big cartons of wonderful milk is already at my house. So you see, that is the little magic, the progress we made during last year about the One Belt, One Road logistic works. How come this is happening? Besides, we have many free trade zones in China, and besides the booming e-commerce like Alibaba, there are real progresses in at least several, almost 10 railway routes, new ones, from China, different parts of China, to different parts of Europe. What we call 中欧班列. That's a fixed route of railway from China to Europe. On their way from China to Europe, of course, they carry lots of Chinese goods. On their way home back home to China, these trains carry, of course, many European goods, and my beloved milk on them. So that is the story. Besides this big event in my family, other big achievements we had. For example, there's a very important document issued in the last session of Boao meeting. That is the vision and actions paper of One Belt and One Road, which explains a lot, but also, I should say, leaves a lot of questions unanswered as well. So that is how important it is. Well, besides that, we signed a few dozen cooperation papers with lots of countries on the Belt and Road Initiative. Russia, of course, Mongolia, Pakistan, and very importantly, I should mention Hungary. Hungary is the first among EU countries to sign such agreement with China. I would love Romania to do the same, but I don't know, that's for our ambassador to speak. And secondly, it's also important, but it's old news, is AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is almost ready to launch, and which Europe is part and parcel of it. 17 or 18 European countries are founding members of this AIIB, which I don't think I need to elaborate more on that. And 2 important figures I have. According to Commerce in China, that FDI, Chinese FDI, into countries along the initiative is 48% higher than the previous year. And the construction contract signed is about 33% higher. Okay, so much for the progress report. Come back to the topics of sharing. I simply could not see why or why not an initiative consulted, constructed, and commonly owned by countries along the initiative could not be shared by all of us together. Then I have to confess, since I said I'm not going to be so diplomatic about it, that there are some things in my mind that's troubling. Question number 1 is this TPP and TTIP. When I'm speaking of TTIP, I should be a little bit, because it's kind of a little bit hazardous to speak of it in this part of the world where TTIP is so popular. at least what I heard from the panels before. But to us, TPP and TTIP is ABC. And since it's ABC, our reaction would be CBA. Well, maybe some of you are confused. What is ABC or CBA about? ABC simply means anyone but China. Look at this TPP. Look at this TTIP. You have two of the most important trading partners of China gangs up together without China. That is at least to some or a lot of people are seeing it this way in China. CBA simply means consensus. There's a consensus in China that we need to do something about it. The B simply means bad feelings, or toxic feelings, actually. It's kind of toxicing, affecting the cooperation atmosphere. People are saying, in today's world, how can people in Europe, you tried so hard to fight against the wars, and then now you are trying to build new ones. That is the feeling, at least. And I asked Madame Benwell yesterday that, are you going to do economic NATOs? Well, she did a very good explanation, saying that the economic NATO is just a trick. They wanted to sell it to politicians. But even that, it's very hard to accept in Asia, China particularly. So what is this A? I would say, my own opinion, A means alternative. If things continue to happen that way, China have to seek alternative. The same thing happened when we see there is dead end in terms of IMF reforms. So you have to seek alternative. Question number 2, is Europe ready? Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready to embrace the One Belt, One Road initiative, as we do? I know, at least I can say for sure, here in Romania, our friends are quite ready. But I don't know, maybe some other people may have a little bit other thoughts. Question number 3, are we ourselves ready? For that, you don't need to be worried about China's ability to mobilize ourselves. We are actually quite mobilized already. What I worry is a little bit overheating, actually. There are too many symposiums and panels in China about One Belt and One Road already. What we lack is coordination and maybe some good luck. Thank you for your attention.
And now the floor belongs to Mr. Iuliu Winkler, which is one of the most notable Romanian members of the European Parliament. Mr. Winkler, please.
Thank you to the Aspen Institute for inviting me to this panel. And if we had the opportunity to hear a vision coming from Beijing, then I think I will try to share with you a vision coming from Brussels, from the European Parliament and the European Commission. We are indeed living interesting times, but also the dynamic of changes and the dynamic of the happenings in Brussels is not the old one. Maybe a decade ago, everybody had the opinion that Brussels is the place of slow motion, of slow decision-making. I think this is changing in a quite serious way. 2 days ago, the European Commission, more specifically DigiTrade, has released the new European strategy for investment and trade. This strategy, of course, it's a large document. It was not written by DG Trade, but it was elaborated on the grounds of public debate, of consultation with the stakeholders and so on. And it was a process which started right after the elections last year in 2014, the elections for the European Parliament, which also brought in office later in the autumn of 2014 a new commission, the new commission led by Jean-Claude Juncker. This document, this new strategy of trade and investment, of course, I have no intention to present it because it's not the topic of our discussion today, but it was discussed, this strategy, yesterday in the European Parliament, in the International Trade Committee, of which I am one of the vice chairs, with Commissioner for Trade, European Commissioner for Trade, Cecilia Malmström. Last night, late at night, we came together with the Bucharest flight. Commissioner Malmström is now here in Bucharest. She is speaking at a different conference about TTIP, about one of the very hot topics for Europe and hot also for Romania, as it was already mentioned, but I think hot for all the Western world. What about China in this strategy? My opinion is that China, even if it's not mentioned 1,000 times, named on its name, but is one of the important players in this strategy. Of course, we focus on TTIP because it's very important and it's one of the priorities, especially since a few days ago TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was signed at a ministerial level. It will be, of course, a very interesting question if Obama will be able to pass this legislation through the Congress. That's not sure at all. And in any case, it will not be easy, but still we have a signature, a signed TPP, and we have a TTIP which is maybe at its halfway in my best evaluation. China, yes, we need an investment cooperation with China. We need trade cooperation with China. We need to observe the common ground, but also, very important, we need to observe all the differences which still have to be mounted, because in the new trade and investment strategy of the European Union, there is a very important place for transparency, because that is expected by our citizen. No agreement will ever pass the European Parliament if it is not understood and finally supported by our constituents, by the people of Europe. And I mean all the people of Europe, the majority of the nations in each member state, because we are there in the European Parliament, representatives of all 28 member states. It's not only rhetoric, it is a real situation, and you could have the example of the ACTA, the anti-counterfeiting agreement, which was very clearly rejected by the European Parliament, even if there were enormous interests linked to the acceptance and application of ACTA. No, European Parliament was not convinced because European citizens were not convinced. And that meant that we rejected ACTA. Back to the investment and trade strategy. We have to promote our values, and trade is an instrument. It was always for the European Union, for Europe. It was an instrument to promote our values, human rights, sustainable development, reflections of 21st century resource policy, and all the very hot questions which are always appearing in bilateral talks. Then, of course, and it's no surprise that, that this trade and investment strategy speaks, as it should speak, about the first interest of the European Union as promoting the multilateral trade dialogue at global level under the auspices of the WTO. Of course, we can be optimistic. No, it's quite difficult to be optimistic about the Doha round, but we can still hope in reviving the talks in the Doha round, and in December in Nairobi, WTO Ministerial Conference will make a new attempt on reviving the Doha round. But in the meantime, we don't have time to expect only the evolutions in the WTO. So it's very clear, it's not a novelty also that the European Union started a formidable, a huge array of bilateral talks. And among those bilateral talks, our talks with China on the investment agreement are very important. Unfortunately, not so many good news I can share with you about the investment dialogue with China. Unfortunately, things are going not on a quite high speed, and there are several reasons for this. There are several bottlenecks that we have. We are looking to a very difficult issue, and if a diplomat was outspoken, then a politician should be also outspoken in this dialogue with you. And I will be the first to name in this panel the hottest potato that the European Union and all the other WTO members have on their table for the moment, which is the market economy status of China. Recognizing this market economy status, which is an element of the accession treaty of China to the WTO. And if this is a binding element of the accession treaty, not everybody is sure of this, but if this is a binding element, then it means that in December 2016, all WTO partners should recognize the market economy status for China. That's a big question. I don't think our panel can comprise a debate about this. I think we need a conference, and it will still not be enough. It's a very serious question. What about the state-owned enterprises? What about the banking system? What about the economic system? Is it really a market economy? It's difficult to answer. But this is just one hot potato. The issue of market access also is a very difficult issue. Our Chinese partners seem to be in favor of pushing some of those issues towards an FTA negotiation, towards a free trade agreement dialogue, which for us, for the European Commission and for the European Union, is an approach that we still have to understand better, and we still have to discuss more, because we think that the investment treaty, the investment dialogue, should be a very sound basis for the future trade agreement. We have an unbalance, and we have to look, and this will be my second outspoken affirmation. We had even a report in the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament 2 or 3 years ago, which was entitled China-EU Unbalanced Trade. This is a reality. This is not an interpretation. We just have to look at the figures, and we see that we are in an unbalanced situation. And of course, the desire and the soundness of a relation should lead us towards seeking balance. Seeking balance in trade, seeking balance in market access, seeking balance in human rights interpretation, in labor rights, in labor conventions, in environment, in all the values which are very important for the European Union. So just to conclude my intervention, one thought about the One Belt, One Road initiative. Because it's true, I just have noted that mainly concepts for the moment, we know mainly concepts for the moment, and if we have initiatives, and I think Romania is one of the active partners in this dialogue, I think it's very good that it is an active partner. We have just discussing before the panel here that how important it is that Romania has a good image in China. And I think that is a very important issue. It comes from the last decades of bilateral relations, but it also, I'm sure, it comes from the efforts of the people who are today working on these relations, diplomats, ambassadors, trade representatives, and so on. So we have favorable auspices, but still some questions, if I have to speak with my Brussels eye, then some questions still hang on. For example, if we look at the map of the Silk Road Initiative, we see that on that map, not the European Union itself is a point, but there are some European member states which appear on the Silk Road map. So this is an issue because trade policy is common European policy. Investment policy indeed is a shared competence. It's shared between the European Union and the member states. So this will be a very interesting situation. This will be something that is, of course, much easier maybe to comprehend from Budapest or from Bucharest, but it's much more difficult to comprehend from Brussels. Is the European Union the partner for China, or are there other possible partnerships which would be preferred by our Chinese partners? And if so, how can those preferences be harmonized with the membership of those member states, of course, to the European Union? How can interests be harmonized in energy policy, in regional development policy, in all the chapters which I don't have now time to repeat, but everybody, I'm sure, knows very well those chapters. How can those interests be harmonized between national capitals, between maybe those European capitals which appear on the Silk Road map, or is that map expandable? Because if we look back in history, several thousand years ago, there was not one Silk Road. The Silk Road was an array of economic and trade relations. It was an array of roads. It was not one road. And of course, I'm not the best man qualified to speak about history, so I will stop here. I did formulate that question, which is a very important question in Brussels. And of course, as you see, that now it seems, yes, we are living interesting times in Europe also, not in our relation with China only, but also in Europe, as we see that multiple divisions seem to part Europe. Multiple differences of interests are arising in the migration issue, in the refugee issue, in economic and trade issues, in the future of European Union, a political union versus a free trade agreement of member states. So many, many questions, but those questions also reflect their meaning on our future relations with China. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Winkler, for this European perspective about how to deal with China, both economically but also politically. Now we are moving to our distinguished panelists, and I will start with His Excellency Doru Costea, Ambassador of Romania to the People's Republic of China. As Mr. Weizhong asked earlier, is Romania ready to embrace China's One Belt, One Road initiative, or Romania sticks to its established commercially, economically paths?
Allow me to leave my hat as an ambassador, and let me assure you that what I'm going to tell you is a byproduct of my mind. So I'm not talking here in my capacity, but rather as a debutant observer of what's going on in China. I've been living there for the last 3 years and 10 months. And how it looks like, how this relationship between China and Europe, and of course Romania, looks like when you look at it from the other side, 7,000 kilometers away. I think that, with your permission, I would pick up on some of what the distinguished speakers have just said and link it to one of the titles in our debate, which is challenge. And I'd say that a first challenge would be what happened almost 25 years ago when China joined WTO. and entered the world. I guess that what China has found ever since surprised it, because the world somehow looked different than how the world had used to look like before. At the same time, the world was equally surprised to see what China meant, and particularly in the last decade, what China has become. So the two sides are, to my mind, on a steep learning curve of understanding what the other one is, means, and does. Another challenge here will be this coming from the Belt and Road Initiative. We talked about it last year. And of course, to say that it is a long-term project would seem to highlight the very obvious. Well, with all due respect, I think that every now and then it is very useful to remember the obvious, because we tend to forget it. So when the Belt and Road Initiative was launched this spring more coherently on a paper, when responsible institutions were nominated, there are three: the National Development and Reform Commission, the Ministry of Commerce, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They are the godfathers or mothers, I'm not sure, of this project. And the key element is NDRC, National Development and Reform Commission. Fine, now things have become clearer. And then, just like Director Shen had said, if you look every single day in China, there are at least 5 events concerning the Belt and Road thing, which is mind-boggling. Not only to us poor foreigners, but also to the Chinese themselves. Because, again, I fully agree with that, a little bit of more coordination will do very much. So this is a challenge for the concept itself. It is also a challenge for the way in which the Chinese mind works. A long-term project, which is not actually a project, it is a vision, it is an outlook, quote unquote, from official statements, which means it will be built as we're trotting along this way. Challenge number 3 would be how China sees this road and how China sees Europe, EU particularly. I will fully support Mr. Winkler's remark on targets, or rather destinations, of this road, which seem to be countries, EU member states. Now, what is EU to China? If I were wicked, I would say it is just what the EU wants it to be. It depends on how EU succeeds in presenting itself to China, in selling itself to China. And here we slip in a conversation that we've just heard before, the previous panel. Extremely tempting, let's don't go that way. Let's come back to this challenge here, which is what happens before we reach Europe. You see, a footnote. It's very useful to use Europe and the European Union alternatively. You never know what you're talking about. Is it Europe or is it the European Union? So let's say Europe, to be on the safe side. Look at the map. How do you reach Europe? At least 4 ways on the map. One of them crosses Central Asia, the Stans, highly stable area, isn't it? The other one crosses the Middle East. Good. Another stable area. So what are we talking about here? Our distinguished moderator has just said growth and stability. Can we be very certain that the relationship between stability and growth is one way? Do we may we have growth only when we have stability. So what do we do first? We will stabilize and then grow? The Chinese philosophy says the other way. We may reach stability if we push growth. Maybe. I don't know. I do not doubt. I am simply ignorant. I don't know. So last, and I thank you for your patience in listening to my ramblings. I guess that I have focused on the challenges because I remember some time ago I found a very nice quotation which is attributed to a musician, a jazz singer. I forgot the name of the jazz singer. But it read, "A challenge is an opportunity to prove your best." So these are challenges to us to prove that we are the best. We, Europeans, we, Romanians, as Europeans that we are, we, Chinese, as our friends. And let me very quickly clarify one or two questions that my friend has raised and put my ambassador's hat back on. Romania signed a document, a memorandum of understanding concerning the Silk Road, the One Belt and One Road, within the joint committee of the Intergovernmental Cooperation, which, by the way, convenes next Tuesday in Beijing. So I'm leaving to Beijing, not right now, a little bit later. Second, the treaties, TPP, TTIP, the alphabet is going on and on. I think that, it was already mentioned, we are striving hard in the EU to have the bilateral investment treaty done by the end of the year. By the way, China is also trying to do the same thing with the United States by the end of the year. Nice race. And that will be one remark, which is also a challenge. The Belt and Road Initiative was mentioned here, particularly from the point of view of infrastructure, logistics, trade, investment. Let me add to that at least one crucial dimension, which is also to be found in official documents, and that is people-to-people contact, which means exchange and sharing of values and more knowledge and understanding. This leads to trust, mutual trust, which leads us to the Young Leaders panel in the afternoon, which is about trust. Thank you.
It was a very full of information speech that you delivered, and I'm saying this as a journalist who feels the information, wherever it is. Now we are moving to Dr. Jing Men, InBev Baillet Latour Chair of European Union-China Relations, and also Director of the EU-China Research Center at the very prestigious College of Europe. We had, until now, the European Parliament point of view on EU-China relations. We also heard Romania's and China's point of view. So now I think it is time to hear an academic point of view on the EU-China relations. How are the political and obviously economical turmoils both in Europe and in China going to affect the bilateral relation, and also how the new realities of the Middle East which is in between the two entities, is going to affect these relations. Please.
First of all, I would like to thank Aspen Institute, particularly Gabriela, because this is the first time for me to be in Bucharest. This is, I would say, a very nice experience, and I really enjoy this opportunity to be here, to join all the distinguished speakers. But as our moderator pointed out, that my point of view and my perspective is different from the first three speakers, because they are decision makers. They are politicians, and they are closely involved in the decision making between Europe and China, between the EU and China. But I am a scholar. I'm different. I just want to share with you my observation as a scholar. As someone who has been living in Brussels for more than nearly 20 years. So I am originally from China, but now I'm based in Europe. This is, in fact, what I would like to clarify before I start. Concerning my own observation, I would like to say the topic that I was given, the East-West trade and investment, the OBER, the One Belt, One Road initiative, and particularly the 16+1 up till now. I think I would like to mention, it's time to mention it. I found the three have a lot of synergies. They are, if we put them together, we can find a lot of opportunities for the two sides to explore, for cooperation, for exchanges. But I think, first of all, I believe that when we talk about 16+1, of course, this is more a geographical concept. It's not really so much politicalized at the very beginning, because I think from the Chinese point of view, why 16? Because they are Central Eastern European countries those countries have relatively good relationship with China, and China, as the result of economic rise and now the second largest economy in the world, and also with huge foreign currency reserve, has increasing capacity of outward investment. So against this background, China finds more complementarity to work with Central Eastern European countries. So that's why more than 3 years ago, this 16+1 initiative was taken, and more platforms that we see that during these years have been established. I'm glad that Ambassador Costea mentioned that people-to-people dimension is very important, because I have noticed during these years, I see that there are a lot of people-to-people contacts between Central Eastern European countries and China in terms of, let's say, education, culture, exposition, even tourism, and then even environmental issues. So there are a lot of people-to-people institutions, platforms that have been established, and a lot of conferences. Indeed, endless conferences. If you go to the websites, no matter from the European side or from the Chinese side, you see that almost every month you see some interesting meetings between China and some of the countries in Central and Eastern European countries. So this is, of course, very nice on the one hand. But on the other hand, I would also, because I'm based in Belgium and I focus on EU-China relations, I would like to say that from Brussels' point of view, as Mr. Winkler pointed out, that there is a concern. Because when we talk about 16+1, it's Europe. And when we talk about EU, of course, EU-China relations, that's the EU, the European Union. And then, of course, there are overlappings among the 16 countries with some of the member states of the EU, but also there are countries which are outside the EU. And there, of course, then politics is introduced. Because if you talk about economic investment, trade relations, it's purely, economic. But nothing is pure. When we talk about economic cooperation, we cannot forget politics behind. And therefore, I heard a lot of concerns in Brussels that when China thought about this initiative, China should also take care of the feeling of Brussels, and China should make clear the position of the EU, the position of the member states, and to coordinate better the positions in relationship with the 16 countries. So this is one difficult challenge for the 16+1 mechanism to continue forward. And another one, I also heard from some Central Eastern European countries, at the very beginning they were very enthusiastic about this initiative because they desperately need some investment in infrastructure, in development. But gradually, somehow, I saw that the enthusiasm is cooling down to a certain degree because such cooperation, of course, 16, it's not so obvious how to put the 16 countries together. Because among the 16 countries, certainly when there is a project and it's cross countries and it needs cooperation. But how these countries can win these projects, it also involves competition. So competition and cooperation coexist in the 16+1 mechanism. And therefore, some of the countries are more active, and some of the countries are more concerned. And I even heard from the Czechs that one of the important reasons for the Czech president to be present at the 3rd September, the military parade in Beijing, was because that he wanted to get more investment from China to the Czech Republic. So that you could see that there is a undercurrent for competition among the 16 countries in this mechanism. So that's another challenge. That's why I would like to say that for both China and the Central Eastern European countries, how to manage such a mechanism, it's not such an easy task. And I also read on the internet yesterday night that Chinese Premier Wang Yi was in Bulgaria yesterday, and he had a meeting with Bulgarian president talking about Central Eastern European country cooperation with China. And I also heard that there will be a very big event in November in Beijing between the 16 countries and China, and also a think tank will be established focusing on the research of 16+1 cooperation under China Academy of Social Sciences. So I see a lot of active initiatives that are going on, and I also see some challenges. So that's why I would like to mention here, in fact, nothing is simple. And just like OBOR, when we talk about OBOR, O-B-O-R, it was a concept that was initiated at the end of 2013. But from 2013 till now, in China, there has been more than 1 million papers published on OBOR. So you could see that this is a concept that is evolving. A lot of substances that still need to be added, and a lot of discussions that are going on in order to give constructive proposals how to develop OBOR. So just like 16+1, they are ongoing projects. They need a lot of efforts from both sides. And then concerning the security challenge, just our moderator gave to me, I personally, and also I read some of the discussions among the scholars concerning the Syrian issue, concerning the security challenges. I would like to say, from my personal perspective, that China is geographically quite far from that area, although this OBOR somehow would certainly pass that part sooner or later. But the issue, I would say, the Syrian issue or the Arab issue in general is too complicated, and I don't think China has so many experts specialized in that security conflicts, and that's why I think it takes time for China to digest the nature of the issue and to find solutions. But I don't think for the moment China is ready to be involved. I will stop here.
Now we move to Dr. Christina Lin, Fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations, Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, for another interesting perspective. How is the situation in the Middle East, especially the rise of the Islamic State, affecting China's own strategy right now? Please.
So very briefly, I'll just cover 3 main points. I'll first provide a snapshot how the rise of ISIS and Islamic extremism in the greater Middle East will impact China's self-growth strategy. And then I'll go over why this shared threat of terrorism and extremism is forging a Moscow-Beijing condominium across Eurasia, especially via the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO. And then I'll conclude with prospects for cooperation between China's Belt and Road initiatives and Europe's own New Silk Road projects. On the ISIS threat, there's been a lot of press coverage on how ISIS and Islamic extremism are a threat to US and to Europe, but little attention on how this impacts China. In September 2013, China rolled out the Belt and Road initiatives, and less than 1 year later, in July 2014, ISIS leader al-Baghdadi, he called for a jihad against countries that, quote, end quote, seized Muslim rights, and he mentioned China first in a list of 20 countries around the world. He referenced Xinjiang numerous times, which is the westernmost province of China and the bridgehead of the economic belt. And he asked Chinese Muslims to plead allegiance to him and threatened to occupy parts of Xinjiang which appeared on ISIS caliphate map. The Chinese were quite concerned by this, and Hong Kong-based Phoenix Weekly actually had this as a cover story, but this was not picked up by the Western press. Now, while the idea of occupying China seems, currently is very far-fetched, the Chinese do have legitimate concern on what amounts to be a declaration of war. Especially since the Aspen Caliphate covers large swath of territories of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO. And for those who are not familiar with the SCO, it's a China-led Eurasian security bloc, kind of a hybrid between EU and NATO, and encompasses China, Russia, the Central Asian republics, excluding Turkmenistan. It just admitted India and Pakistan, and Iran is next, now that UN sanctions have been lifted. In the July SCO summit this year, the two core missions discussed were admitting India and Pakistan and how best to combat ISIS and Islamic extremism. So this threat looms large in SCO consciousness. With the admission of India and Pakistan underway, the Aspen Caliphate now includes SCO territories of Central Asia, of Kashmir, of AFPAC, Chechnya, Xinjiang, that have had ongoing extremist activities. So SCO has a risk of their fighters bringing Syrian jihad back home and radicalizing their large Sunni Muslim population. China alone has over 20 million Sunni Muslims. So what's China's response? China's responding to the security challenge by beefing up SCO to combat terrorism across Eurasia. And actually, December last year, when Premier Li Keqiang visited Kazakhstan, he said that SCO should become the guardian of Eurasia and that the Silk Road, the new Silk Road, need a SCO security cover. And I know there's been a lot of skepticism over the prospect of any meaningful cooperation, Sino-Russian cooperation, especially the perception of Russia's Eurasia Union competing with China's Silk Road economic belt across Central Asia. But against the backdrop of Western sanctions on Russia over Ukraine and the sheer threat of ISIS and increasing terrorism in the Caucasus and Xinjiang, Russia and China are now forging a condominium in Eurasia. And actually, Yung Soon of Stimson Center came out with a pretty good article recently. She called it an alignment without alliance, whereby Russia would be the guarantor of security and China as the largest economic player in sort of across Central Asia and larger Eurasia. This was evidenced back in May when China attended the Victory Day parade in Russia, and Putin and Xi Jinping signed a joint declaration on unifying the Eurasia Union with the economic belt with SCO as a coordinating platform. So, given that SCO is a joint Sino-Russian initiative, they'll coordinate, Russia's pet project of the Eurasia Union and China's Silk Road underneath this SCO umbrella. On the security front, Russians also proposed a closer CSTO and SCO cooperation, given a lot of members overlap, and also to set up a standing contingent of SCO peacekeeping force, kind of similar to what China just did. Just last month, Xi Jinping announced he would, stand up 8,000 troops for UN on permanent standby for, worldwide deployment anywhere, perhaps Syria, and he also committed $1 billion to UN for the Peace and Development Fund. China and Russia and SCO have also increased their joint counter-terror exercises with 7,000 troops in Inner Mongolia last year, and of course we saw their joint naval war games in the Mediterranean and the Western Pacific earlier this year. So as China's One Belt, One Road and SCO are consolidating across Eurasia, what are the prospects of cooperation between China's initiatives and Europe's New Silk Road? I think if we can manage, not necessarily resolve, but manage the security piece, in the Middle East and Central Asia, prospects are good for cooperation or coordination between China and Europe for East-West integration. For example, the Winkler plan, the 315 billion euro infrastructure investment that's contingent on market financing. It can leverage China's capital export drive for European growth. And actually, just a couple of weeks ago, China announced that it will commit between 5 to 10 billion euro to the fund, the first non-EU country to do so. And China also has its own infrastructure fund, $100 billion consisting of 40 billion Silk Road Fund focused on Central Asia, the 50 billion with matching contribution with AIIB, and 10 billion to BRICS, New Development Bank. So I think there's room for coordination. I know there are obviously a lot of challenges. Earlier we discussed, the panelists discussed, how there will be we need to harmonize different standards on environmental, health standards, and what have you. But I think the overall framework for cooperation, the sort of basic foundation is there for coordinating, infrastructure investments and development. And I also think that the SCO model, it's a model of cooperative security. It's not an alliance, but it's a model of cooperative security and partnership on interest-based issues, especially non-traditional security challenges. And I think this model dovetails quite well with EU Commission's model of the EU 4Cs project on sub-regional multilateralism with a view towards EU enlargement. This was a project back 2009 to 2011 on integrating the sub-regions of Caspian Sea, Black Sea, Baltic Sea, and Mediterranean Sea. And currently, Aspen Institute has a similar project, integrating the 3 seas of Caspian Sea, Black Sea, and Adriatic Sea. So I think by coordinating with China's One Belt, One Road and infrastructure funds, this could be extended to integration of the 4 seas, including the Mediterranean, especially with China using the Greek port of Piraeus as the main hub and linking via rail to Central Europe. So I think this sort of Russian Matryoshka doll model of integration, whereby you have a set of dolls of decreasing sizes placed one inside another, akin to EU macro region as a sum of different smaller regions or smaller sea regions, may be a good model for China-Europe partnership for East-West integration. And if Russia, China, and India can cooperate in the SCO, and China and India are currently from October 12 to 22nd conducting joint counter-terror exercises in China. Imagine that. If they can cooperate in the SCO, I think that China and Europe can certainly try to merge and coordinate their initiatives across Eurasia. Thank you.
Now we are moving to Theresa Fallon, Senior Associate, European Institute for Asian Studies, one of the best-known experts on China. A lot of provocative ideas were launched today in this debate that we had. Can you tell us how the European countries can resist to the so-called Chinese charm, so that the European Union can have a common policy on China?
How many of you have been to China in the last 2 years since the Silk Road was announced? Hands up. Okay, this is great. Silk Road fever has gripped China. And if you're there in the last 2 years, you might have felt it. And different panelists here have mentioned how many conferences have been in China, how many discussions about the Silk Road, how much money and effort is being put into this. So, as Jing also mentioned, over 1 million papers have been written on this subject. So, welcome to China's age of ambition. In the past, Deng Xiaoping had said, "We will cross the river by carefully feeling the stones." Well, that's finished. Under Xi Jinping, it's a new era. And what's happening is that he's announced this new strategy 2 years ago. It's not a strategy, it's an initiative, the Silk Road Initiative. And it's a complete change in China's foreign policy. Can you feel the tectonic shift in the plates of the world? But this also introduces a paradox. Because in the past, China was already doing these things. It was investing in Central Asia. It was doing all of these types of policies, investing in Piraeus over, back in 2005. They started their initial investment negotiations. So this has been going on for a very long time. And so it can't fail in one sense because it's been announced, it's an initiative, but it's also kind of a kitchen sink. It catches everything, old policies as well as new policies. So it's a system that really can't fail. So then why recently did Xi Jinping one of the advisors to Xi Jinping write a letter warning against the dangers of making too many promises with the Silk Road. He stated, China should be careful not to overpromise and underdeliver. So this is taking on a life of its own in one sense because it's a top-down. So Xi Jinping announced this initiative, and each region in China is working very, very hard to make it successful for them. For example, in Brussels, we had this very charming, I call it dance diplomacy. One of the regions in China sent a group of dancers, and it's kind of a hybrid Broadway meets Chinese traditional dance show, trying to give the story of the Silk Road, the Maritime Silk Road, and giving like a historical angle to it. So each region is trying to think of ways to please the central government, or and how can they make the most of this? So we're also seeing, for the first time, it has had some great successes. For example, China's trade and investment has surpassed Russia's in Central Asia for the very first time. Now, I see three drivers. I mean, everyone on the panel has mentioned what these are, so I see it as intermestic. It starts first for China. It's important for their local economy, their domestic economy. Security issue with Xinjiang, as Dr. Lin was just discussing, it's intermestic, it's domestic and international. So they feel that by investing in this region, it will curtail any sort of radical Islamic movements, but that remains to be seen. Energy security, this has been going on for a long time already, before even the announcement of this with the gas pipelines from Turkmenistan. And food security. We had like a Guinness Book of World Records train trip from Yiwu in China all the way to Madrid, and the longest train trip ever. And so the train delivered all sorts of objects and goods to Madrid, and then many of the train cars had to be put on a ship and sent back to China because Spain didn't have enough things to send back to China. So instead of calling it OBOR, the One Belt, One Road, some people are calling it the OBAO, One Belt, One Way. So China, with its great ability to manufacture, and it's kind of maybe dumping goods, maybe high-speed trains will dump goods faster into Europe. So we have to do maybe a cost-benefit analysis on what really is beneficial for Europe on this. Okay, so managing expectations I talked about. And it's top-down, because we talk about the Silk Road, it has this very kind of romantic notion. Xi Jinping, even when he made his speech, he talked about camel bells and smoke rising and created this very beautiful picture, but it never had a name until a German anthropologist coined it in the mid-1800s. So this idea of one belt, one road gives almost a historic feeling that China was always there, this trade always happened, but it's more complex than that, and there were many roads. The Indians had the tea road, or they also had the cotton road, and they feel, is there a hidden agenda here? What does this all mean? And now with China's slowing economy, some economic analysts have wondered, with all of this money pledged to various funds, is it a case of overstretch? Has China promised too much and they can't deliver? Also, I mentioned earlier about the dumping of excess capacity. This is a real concern for Europe. China will have another route to export their goods. Jing mentioned the 16+1, but we see that Europe is a bit divided on these issues. And I would say that the Czech president's visit to the Victory Parade in Beijing, he broke ranks. He was the only elected official who went from Europe. So there was kind of an understanding among all the leaders that they wouldn't go because of what the parade represented, but he went, as Jing said, to try to please the Chinese and get more money. So we're seeing a gentle erosion of values in Europe. So what does Europe really stand for? How many leaders meet with the Dalai Lama? The European Parliament gave him the Sakharov Prize, but I would doubt that many of the leaders would even meet with him now, which is kind of a sad comment on what's happening in Europe. Human rights is something that's not supposed to be mentioned. We saw that in the headlines of today's press out of Britain, because Xi Jinping is going on a visit in the next days, and Europe, Britain is being accused of bending over backwards to please the Chinese. So what does this really mean for Europe, who's worked so hard to come up with these values and system? What will that mean for the long term? Another challenge I see is Russia. The first Silk Road map that we saw showed it skirted this time last year. I asked you about this. Why did the Silk Road skirt Russia? It went around it. And now we see, this kind of awkward, train right up to Moscow and then back down again. So Russia is a bit skeptical about the whole thing, but now they're warming up to it. They're in a very difficult economic situation, and this is something that they're agreeing to with one hand open, I think, and the other one a bit worried. Also, we worry about regime change in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. We have aging leaders there. What will happen? These are key players on the Silk Road. So what will the next leadership look like? So these are big challenges. Okay, so then looking forward to the future. China's increased investment activity will bring an increased military presence to the region. This region here, Romania, has already seen in May, in the Black Sea, China-Russia had a maritime exercise. So these are baby steps, but over time, what will it look like? Because like any other country in history, China will, protect its investments. And what's something I call the South China Sea squeeze. All we hear about is, the great fruits of the Silk Road, or possible fruits of the Silk Road. And we also, in different panels, we talked about, the little green men. What about the little blue men? So the Silk Road is almost a distraction factor because everyone thinks we can make money, let's get in the gravy train and line up for possible benefits. But what will this mean for the rules-based international order on territory and sovereignty in the South China Sea, for example? So we need to think about how Europe and the US have an interest to build up a robust multilateral and rules-based order. We talked about the Winkler plan, so that's in the early days. And it will be interesting how that plan will be shaped. And then, is this a win-win scenario? Or actually granting the Politburo increasing leverage over Europe's and Central Asia's economic and political life? So that's the last question I'd like to raise, and I look forward to your questions in the Q&A.
You've talked about the structural changes that China is experiencing right now, also the internal and external challenges. And you also talked about the game of promises and deliveries, a game that is very well known here in Europe and also in the United States, that can be quite dangerous when the level of promises is too high and the deliveries are too low. So thank you very much for the analysis. We should stop here, but not before taking one or two questions from the audience for these brilliant experts that we had here and the three decision makers that shared the floor with us.
My name is Mirhat Sharifjan. I'm from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Very interested in China because I'm from Kazakhstan originally. We know from history that any cooperation between China and Russia goes to some extent and then stops there. And then when I was a soldier of the Soviet Army in Omsk, in Siberia, I remember during the exercises, the major enemy during the exercises was Chinese army. It's in the past, of course, but remember what Zbigniew Brzezinski said, that any partnership between China and Russia, in this partnership, Russia will be always on the second level, and Russia will never be able to continue that kind of cooperation. Don't you think that this latest initiatives, cooperation, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all these things are temporary and someday it will collapse? Because we know that there are many countries in this organization called SCO, but major players are China and Russia, and everything depends upon them. Thank you.
No, yeah, I mentioned earlier in my presentation that there's a lot of skepticism on, their cooperation, and once again, I quite agree with Dr. Yunsen from Stimson talking about, how Westerners tend to just have two views. It's either a temporary meeting, China and Russia either have access of convenience, temporary meeting of minds over an issue, or, they're hyperventilating over some sort of new alliance that's going to undermine the global liberal order. And I think it's the third way. I think right now, because of international security, what's happened with globalization, and also with what's happening in Syria and Afghanistan, that's sort of spilling over in their backyard and also in their own territory, that they have this overriding strategic convergence. So they have this alignment, and these are long-term threats and long-term interests. So they can have strategic alignment on these long-term interests without getting too close, without any alliances, because China wants to maintain its freedom, of action. SCO has always been very economic focused, whereas Russia, they have the CSTO and they try to militarize SCO, and China's always put a stop to it. But I think right now, with increasing militarization of trade, of economics and stability, and also militarization of energy security, they kind of meet at that nexus. So I think they will have this condominium, this understanding of cooperating on these long, sort of big overall strategic issues, while having room, to move and for their conflicts to play out without undermining their kind of strategic partnership.
The SCO it's almost, as you said, there are two major players. There's China and Russia in the SCO. But like NATO, I think it's kind of almost a mere structure in that sense. It's not, the same, but the idea that you can look like you have other people cooperating with you, other countries and powers cooperating with you, is something very, very beneficial. Excuse me, sorry. But I'll give you a recent example, and I don't know why the journalists weren't all over this story. 2 weeks ago, it was announced in various media, one coming from Israel. We had a discussion on the bus about that yesterday, some from Britain, but they were kind of newspapers nobody ever heard of, that China was sending their aircraft carrier to support Russia in Syria. And the China scholars were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. Is there any evidence? Let's look at the satellite imagery. But people who work on Russia know that there's a lot of disinformation going on constantly. So the fact that China didn't say anything, though, for 2 weeks, China knew these reports were circulating. And I even asked people at the mission, what about these reports? And they were just like, what reports? I haven't heard about them. So they were out for 2 weeks. And then China just came out about 2 days ago saying, no, we're not sending the Liaoning aircraft carrier to Syria. So Russia, in that sense, uses China to show, hey, it's not just us. We've also got this big power behind us as well. So Russia, can benefit by this as well in terms of propaganda and showing that they're not 100% alone. But it is kind of a frenemy relationship. I think it's very awkward, and I think both of them are, I think Russia's really got its back up against the wall.
Well, the question you mentioned, just show how successful, or why we were successful in our dealing with Russia, and not so successful with Europe. My point is that a little bit of an insider during the dealings with both Russia and Europe. When we are dealing with our Russian friends, the atmosphere is very light, very friendly as with the European countries, but you don't have quite the reservations. You don't need to brace for values. You don't need to brace for Dalai Lamas. You just sit there, relax, and say what you have, what you want, and what I can do for you, what you can do for me. Things like that. It's kind of very relaxed manner. But the other way around with Europe, sometimes it's different. I'm here listening to doctors and panelists. I should say there are reasons why doctors are doctors. But I should also remind you that Confucius or the other saints said, the weakest point or the softest spot in human being, or if you wanted to be a good man, is you should watch your keenness to be teacher. If you know Chinese, it's 人之患在好为人师. Your symptoms or your illness is your desire, your keenness to be teacher. I would just say stop here. That is why I'm so glad that today somebody from China like me can sit on a very level or common ground, level ground together with our European friends, seeing in literal sense, eye to eye with each other. No one is condescending, no one is overbearing. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a second, Mr. Winkler, before you answer to the question, I want to, with all due respect, I want to say my point of view that whenever China discusses with its European friends or with its American friends, a key of a good understanding is to really understand that the Dalai Lama topic, let's so to say, it's really important for our culture, for us, especially knowing where are we coming from. Maybe a key for unlocking the relationship is for the European countries or for the United States to understand some of your of China's own sensitivities and so on. But it is important to know for the Chinese people to understand that these things are really important. They really matters for us. Thank you. Please, Mr. Winkler.
Thank you very much, and it's not so easy now after a few comments to remember the original question, because the original question was about China, about Russia. Of course, I will also pretend not to remember it, because my intervention is caused by my before speaker. And yes, we can. Well, it's not so easy to go back in history when you have people who know about history in the same panel, and I'm only a poor engineer and an economist. But still, in the question it was that things, cooperations and relations and systems are temporary. But of course, they are temporary. We have for each relationship, for an economic relationship, for a political relationship, I believe we have a period of birth, then we have a period of growth, and then we have eventually an old age and a death for all relationship, because that was over history the same. Going back to the 20th century, the 20th century, I believe it was full of misery, full of pain, and full of disrespect of fundamental human values. So that when you speak in and about Europe and in and about the European Union in the 21st century, you have to speak about values, you have to speak about human rights, you have to speak about culture, about history, about future in terms of sustainable development, about future in terms of rights of children, of rights of women, of a better society, because we have had our miseries in the 20th century. Enough of those miseries. Of course, probably cultural values, not probably, certainly, cultural values are not the same over civilizations. Some speak about the clash of civilizations. I don't know if we necessarily have to have a clash, but we have to have dialogue for sure, and we have to have mutual respect. And then for the period of life of a certain relationship, be it a few years or be it a few decades, still, if it can bring development, if it can bring improvement in the sense of our common shared values, then of course that's much more important than a very simple and friendly discussion about exchanging a few barrels of oil against a few Kalashnikovs. Thank you very much.
I think China's One Belt, One Road initiative is the most important one we have ever seen since the Second World War. It's even more important than Marshall Aid that we have seen for the reconstruction of Europe. But this is a gigantic project, I believe, that cannot be managed only by China. China doesn't have experience of such large-scale international engagement, bringing together key stakeholders. When you look at the project, It involves 65 countries, both the Silk Road as well as ancient maritime road and Pakistan, economic corridor. It also involves 4.4 billion people, and it goes through the world's most unsecure and unstable regions, be it through the Central Asia or Malacca Strait and the Middle East. And it also involves hundreds of billions of dollars. So therefore, a country like China, which has a reputation of getting things done effectively in its own country and surrounding region, but has no experience of such large-scale efforts, I think will face daunting difficulties and challenges. So without effective partnerships, cooperation and support from both the countries through which Silk Road will go, and also major powers like Russia, US and European Union, it will be very, very difficult to go through. So I think we should see this challenge, and it shouldn't be only falling on the shoulders of China to undertake this initiative. It should involve all other powers, which is not something easy to do. I don't know how you see that, because there is also a risk of China losing face if it doesn't go through effectively, because for President Xi Jinping, this is a legacy project. It's a huge undertaking. Thank you.
So now I got time to elaborate on my three principles of the Belt and Road Initiative. The three principles being consultation together, and building together, and share together. So if we stick strictly to these three principles, I don't think you have reason to worry about it. For example, Lin mentioned just now about was a progress actually just made a few days ago when China and EU signed the MOU on the connectivity platform between, literally as between Belt and Road and the Juncker Plan, which, as mentioned, we were the first non-EU country to make our contribution to the Juncker Plan. Which, to do this, we had, in my ministry, done lots of consultations with our counterpart, with our ambassadors, to make it possible. That we wanted to, you have a good plan, we have a good plan, let's do it together. Let us connect it together. That is the idea we're following strictly. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I hope we avoided the Kalashnikov. Please? Okay.
Add something?
Please.
Yes. I totally agree with the comments made by the person just now. Just one point that I would like to add for this One Belt, One Road initiative. I think the Chinese government's vision is that it will be a task for the coming 3 to 4 decades. So it's not a short-term initiative. It will be aimed for a very long-term effort. So I don't think Xi Jinping will complete this project or task within his 10 years mission. So that's why I think the most important, fruitful achievements, if we ever can make, it will be in the coming 2-3 decades. So we have to wait and see. And then the second point is, of course, along the road, more than 60 countries are involved. But I don't think all the countries will be involved in an equal way. It will only be based on a selective approach. That's what I personally think, that because some of the countries are more capable, are more active, and then some others, of course, they are, with less, let's say, mature conditions for cooperation, and that's why I think there might be different tiers of cooperation along the Silk Road. And then another point I would like to add is, of course, Chinese government is very active in promoting this OBER, and I also totally agree that this has to be realized with the joint efforts, not only from China, because China is the starting point, but we need all the other countries to cooperate in order for the OBER to be realized. to be completed in a successful way. And even the UK, because in the old design, the destination will be in European harbors like Rotterdam, Antwerp, Duisburg in Germany. I don't think the UK is mentioned, but Xi Jinping will visit the UK in the coming days. And it's said now by the UK media that it is the golden time between China and the UK, because now UK is also actively thinking of being involved in the investment AIIB, of course, and also in joining the Silk Road Initiative for financial management along the Silk Road. So that's what I would like to add. I will stop here.
Thank you. Okay, but please make it short, otherwise the moderator will be severely punished.
Thank you for your excellent intervention. As an economic historian, I just want to add, because I looked at what's happening now, past, and future, but I didn't mention, why did the Silk Road end? We have to ask ourselves that. Why did it end? And this is one of the most dangerous regions in the world. And with low oil prices, 90% of world trade anyway goes by sea. So to spend all this money building railways and protecting them and securing them and maintaining them, because it's not just building them, it's also maintaining them, it's going to be hugely expensive. So we really have to do a cost-benefit analysis. And with low oil prices, nothing can beat a massive container ship. And the infrastructure is built for that. So, and finally, on state-owned enterprises, Xi Jinping has talked about reforming them, but to build up the Silk Road Initiative, many economists see that this would be, sweets for the state-owned enterprises. We've seen the two railway companies in China being merged into one, so there's no competition, it's just one. And railways are part of the initiative. Also, in England, they're talking about building a high-speed railway from London to Birmingham, so that would be part of the catch-all Silk Road Initiative. So this idea of competition in Central and Eastern Europe, I think, as you said, it's losing momentum because member states have cottoned on. You know, that everyone has to kind of like, pick me, and everyone's trying to say like, oh no, I'll do this, I'll go to Beijing, or I'll do this, or we'll give you that. So I think they've figured it out, and a lot of the promised money hasn't arisen, hasn't come. And we know, for example, with the Polish road project, that failed. So I'll leave it at that, but it's a long-term initiative, as Jing has stated, and I think Europe should really look at it with their eyes wide open and not rush in, really examine it carefully. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I thank to all the keynote speakers and the panelists for their very good information, for the wonderful analysis that they delivered, and I also thank to the Aspen Institute for the opportunity to have this discussion here. It's not a discussion that we have every day in Romania. Thank you to the audience for the questions and for the attention. Thank you.